Surah 17. The basis of this surah was probably Meccan, but much of it seems to belong to the early Medinan period. Verse 1, the famous verse of the night journey, stands isolated and has no connection with what follows. It would connect better with verse 103, which may at one time have stood here, and after undergoing several revisions, have been discarded in favor of verse 2 to 8, which are certainly Medinan. They may have been connected to 9 through 16. The context of verses 17 and 18 is not clear, but they show signs of Medinan phraseology and may be related to verses 2 through 8 as a hint of the destruction of the Jewish towns, verse 19 to 22, which perhaps shows the influence of Matthew 6, 1 through 6, are out of connections and may perhaps have been used for the insertion of verse 17 and 18. Verses 23 to 40 are sort of imitation of the Decalogue. The original prohibitions were in the second person singular, and to judge by verse 41, which forms the conclusion of the passage, were addressed to the prophet. These were no doubt Meccan, but inserted amongst them are others addressed to the people, which were probably later in Medina. Verse 42, dealing with angel worship, is also addressed to the people and may have been added at the same time. In verse 43 to 46, we seem also to have a passage addressed to the prophet with an addition, 46, addressed to the people. From here onward, verse 68, we have a series of rather unconnected passages. Meccan or early Medinan, which have been revised for inclusion in the surah. The same passage, verse 69 to 74, is again disjointed and occupies about the same space as verse 75 to 79. 80 to 83, more exactly, if we regard verse 79 as a later insertion and 83 as a later alternative to 82, these passages are usually regarded as Meccan, but if they were written on the back of 69 to 74, they must be early Medinan. So also the passage dealing with the Quran, verse 84 to 86, 90 to 101, which probably stood on the back of verse 87, 88 to 89, 102 to 111, which consist of disjointed passages. The position of 100 to 101 is a little doubtful. They seem to connect with 99, but might be earlier and detached. Verse 52, in which case you should stand on the left of the page before 102. Surah al-Isra, the chapter of the night journey, and we find it's also called the, the children of Israel, Bnei Israel, the night journey, Meccan. So the first verse, warning to the Jews, 2 through 8, Medinan. The Quran is a guidance, probably the same time as 1. So verse 9 through 16. And the Kaaba, the farthest mosque, it's not just the cube, but it's, a certain amount of space around it. Well, the farthest mosque is the temple at Jerusalem. Not just the temple, but it's the Mount Moriah there. The sacred mosque, the Kaaba, but it goes beyond the Kaaba. So this the Judeo-Christian idea that it's just this building, it's not. And when you go to a masjid, the mosque may include the bathroom and some part of the kitchen where you never pray, even when there's overflow or something, or you can do things that perhaps you can't do in a masjid. That, so the idea of a masjid and other stuff. Now, if there's a bathroom in the middle of the sacred precincts, that's not saying that everywhere outside the bathroom is, but you know what I mean. But man prays is why makes it fully understandable why verse, man, they pray, people want evil things as they pray for good. And did they want the harm to come, or do they actually want evil? Yeah, people want both. So yeah. So the disappearance of the night and the day, the sign of the night And Noah, the ark, something difficult to refer to. Corruption of the earth twice over. So the Israelites, then the Jews, and then the Zionists. Is there going to be 2 periods of Zionist rule? So it's interesting because the children of Israel, and then you had the parents of the Jews, but the Maccabees and the Bar Kokhba revolution kind of took that away. Now we're under the Zionist thing. And so is that going to be a third thing of the same thing? Because Zionism isn't exactly the same thing as Judaism, because it's not confined to Judaism, and Judaism doesn't require it. And it's a little bit more, it's actually probably more difficult than the issue of Sufi and Muslim. But anyways, the rising to a great height, the great length. But there's a prophecy put down in the book, the second time still to come and averted. There's a lot of talk about the end time signs. There's over 90 things that are supposed to happen. There's people who actually want to bring them about, just like a lot of the Christians that play that game. But we're going to leave that be, because trying to hasten the end times, we're told about not hastening the punishment, not this and that and the other. But while hastening the punishment is somebody's found guilty of a crime, and then, but everyone gets his reward. Early Medinan, verse 19 to 22. Oh, and I guess 17 and 18 is with that. And there's a book that records our deeds at the resurrection day. There's going to be a record that's going to prove everything detail by detail. And then there's going to be witnesses and all sorts of interesting stuff, right? And when you add it together, it makes a lot more sense than any piecemeal part of it, and especially with stuff that's doesn't quite make as much sense. The duties of the believers, verse 24 to 42. Might, connects to 9 through 11. Meccan and Medinan. Lower the wing of humility, acting humbly. And habitually resorting. Well, perhaps there's an angelic presence to it. That's why the reference to the wing, right? Niggardly is in stingy, of course. So people oppressing people, and people, don't keep your hand chained to your neck. Just, do what you need. And honestly, if you don't help people, when you come to need help yourself, people aren't going to help you, or they may, it really makes the difference too. So even selfish people have reason to help people now while they can and can afford it. And then people will help them when they need it, And we don't need all the insurance policies. We actually develop that as a society. We can get up on all the insurance, and we can actually help people better than insurances ever can, whether life insurance, house insurance, whatever. Or perhaps insurance policies where people form a grouping together, or something that's like, here's a fund. If people need help, if it's going to be me, if it's going to be someone else, somebody gets helped. It's not to make a profit off it. It's not cause, economic rules, right? Now there's sanction for the avenger, if they're helping, but it's not calling for mere vigilante justice. You still want to have people tried and found guilty, and not just assume, and not just he said, she said, even if it seems predominant against the accused or the other way around. You got to be careful with those judgments. Responsible, as in one asked about. Possessor thrown away, hey, you can't stop God. So verse 20, Surah 23, 93. The purpose of the Qur'an, verse 43. So kind of a 2 Timothy 3:16 sort of thing, right? In a way, right? Argument against polytheism, 43 to 46. Unbelievers' version of the Quran, Meccan, 47 to 51. Believers to be conciliatory, late Meccan, early Medinan, verse 56. Probably later than 55, so 55, 56, 57, Futility of treating other things as gods, Meccan with Medinan alterations 58 to 60. That is big in your breasts. You're having the feeling that something's significant. In the grave, a little while, we'll all be dead anyways, relatively speaking, anyways, mentioning God alone, his unity, or that God is only, or perhaps some people want God stuff. When you mention God, they all want to throw something in that's not dealing with God. Maybe connected like a prophet or something, but it's the idea is like, in terms of like worship or something, people want partners to God. That's the idea. They want to misassociate things. That's being pulled from. And of course, the scripture, Psalms is a type of scripture. The signs not given to Muhammad, because they want all the physical signs they've heard of before. Meccan, verses 61 and 62. Story of Iblis, 63 to 68. Late Meccan, early Medinan. The tree of Zakum, like 37, verse 60. 44, verse 43, and 56, verse 52 is referred to the tree cursed, and it relates to the word like a cold or something. The zakum is the stifling, choking sort of. It's difficult to swallow thing. But the literal mention in the Quran in 85, verse 20 of God encompassing the people, it's generally not referred to. Well, God's all-encompassing, God's omnipresent, but God's not the creation, and God's not like a circle around creation either. We're not limiting God by space. Ever present doesn't justify the idolaters. I don't know where people get this idea that if God's omnipresent but not creation, that solves the whole thing. You got to, Surah 112, not like anything and anything, right? So God is every good and useful thing, but beyond the terms of the creation. So that's really relatively easy to understand, I think. But the visions, like in 53, and also 8:45, and other parts of the Quran, but the visions can refer to something more than the Quran, but the comment of this chapter being learned obviously is referring to the ascent where Muhammad learned all the rules for the prayer. Allah's help and man's help. Ingratiate perhaps early with rhymes added, joins to 68, so 69 to 74. Muhammad, they tempt him to compromise. So Muhammad's tempted to compromise and do what he wants with the religion, but the prophet continues in piety, verse 80 to 83. Helping as avenging. People are ungrateful to God, and stuff may, happen as a result of their ingratitude that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Imam may refer to the prophet, may refer to the book of record, something that leads them. The Quran not appreciated by some people, 84 to 86. The spirit, early Medinan. Revelation may be withheld, 88 and 89. Stinginess, early Medinan, 102 to 108. Oh, no, just 102. Okay, sorry. The excellence of the Quran and people's unbelief. So 90 to 102. The mission of Moses, like Meccan, and possibly have followed verse 1. So 103 to the end, right? Oh, wait, no, just 109 were those prostrations. But before maybe we're not even going to mention that in this comment here. There's a delay. Where's the delay? Well, the ascending, angels ascending before one's eyes. We're talking about the ascent of Muhammad within this chapter. So stuff like this totally makes sense. That, people don't want a human messenger, 96 and 97, but, who are we going to believe? But somebody that we can, there's intervals with delay. Where's the other? Oh, the revelation, sending down. It's interesting that revelation and iron are referred to with the same sort of language in the Quran. Allah or Ar-Rahman, optional names. Yeah, if you're going to pray on your own, you can use a divine quality, or you can just call on God's self. Doesn't matter as much as one might think. Surah 18, the introduction to this surah, verse 1 through 4, is Medinan in origin, but has been revised. New rhyme phrases being attached to verse 1 and 2, and verse 3, 4 directed against the Christians being added, verse 5 and 8, leading up to the story of the 7 sleepers, probably belong to the same time as the revision, but the story had an earlier basis. This appears in verse 9 through 11, which has been discarded, and a new version substituted, verse 12 to 20a. There are some signs that phrases from an earlier version are incorporated in this, but whether these come from a continuation of verse 9 through 11 or from some intermediate one, it is difficult to say, though verse 9 through 11 seem fairly complete in themselves and apparently date from the time when the length of time between death and the resurrection was an objection which Muhammad had to meet. That the attempt to use this story placed him in difficulties is evident from verse 20b to 25, which are probably never intended to be published. From here on to 44, we have a fairly continuous passage, probably earlier than the final form of the introduction, and the story of the 7 sleepers, verse 45 to 51 are discontinuous. Well, they're continuous in Arabic, but verse 52 refers to the parables contained in 45 to 51. Oh, wait, verse 52 refers to the parables contained in verses 31 and 43. Verse 52 to 58 are there were probably a slightly later insertion written on the back of 45 to 51. The story of Moses here is told quite different from the other accounts of Moses found in the Quran. It must be either late Meccan or very early Medinan. It may belong to the same time as the first form of the story of the 7 sleepers. The story of the Qarnayn may, as A. Mueller suggests, have been introduced because of the questions of some who recognize in the story of Moses and Al-Qadr elements from the legend of Alexander the Great, although we see evidence from the Quran and Hadith that it wasn't Alexander the Great. Verse 86 and 87 are almost certainly Medinan, but they are longer than the rest and are possibly a later insertion. The use of mufsidun, working corruption, in verse 93 perhaps indicates a Medinan date for the whole story, and this would be confirmed if we could be sure that it was written on the back of scraps contained verses 99 to 110. Now, there's the talk about the last 10 verses and the first 10 verses, or the chapter as a whole, as a protection against the false Messiah at the end of times. This is, of course, by belief in it and the meaning having its effect. But this chapter was learned all at once. It was said all at once to answer 3 questions of a group that came to that gathering. So that refutes a lot of what we're going to hear as terms of Medina and Mecca and whatever. But Surat Al-Kahf, chapter of the cave, the book and its purpose, early Medinan, verse 1 through 4, the legend of the 7 sleepers, Meccan, 9 through 20. Oh, wait, no, it's more than that, 25. Yeah, it's 25. Profit not to worry at unbelief. So 5 through 8. Struck upon their ears, and the place is sealed, usually interpreted as meaning put to sleep. But it's worth considering whether the sense is not that a number was actually stamped upon their ears. I'm not familiar with anybody saying that before, so let's leave that. Perhaps if they believe not, so referring instead of in because. And this discourse, Muhammad's teaching, perhaps story, so not just his recital of revelation, but his inspired teachings might be implied there. High, as in of a sandy height. So that stuff to that was places with the caves to the north and that dry place and all that could be alluded to connecting the 7 sleepers. 9 through 11 is thought to like be intermediate in the middle of here. Okay. There's much difference of opinion prevailing as to the identity of Araqain, some holding it to be the name of the mountain or the village associated with them. Others say that it's the name of their dog. Some say it's just a generic thing of inscription. And so, Tori suggests that it's a misreading of Decius as written in Hebrew colors, characters. But what is Decius? If it's Decius is a completely different word. I don't know. E.J. Brown, Oriental Studies, page 459, makes that claim here. Encouragement to proceed with his work, 26 through 30. So throwing stones at the unseen, the people was, saying which number is right. This is just saying people were throwing guesses at the number, and it doesn't really matter. All we know, there's some people and a dog, and the number isn't important. And perhaps it's not, the whole point is it's not one of those numbers, right? Maybe it's 9 and their dog, right? That would be very symbolic in terms of some of the stuff that went on in that area since prehistory. So parable against confidence and wealth, 31 to 42. Okay, what's the talk about the moisture? Okay, the aid, they want, the people in hell want moisture to come and put out the fire, obviously. Geth and Guth, so there's supposed to be a pun there and there with a change of vowel in reference to fruit, wealth apart from the garden, which indicates the usual interpretation. There's a lot of stuff like that in the Quran. People say, well, if it's poetry, it has to have these extra letters, but everything is inherent to the meaning. There's not anything entirely extra you can say. You can summarize it a little bit by taking a little bit here off, but whatever, you're still conveying more meaning. And sometimes with poetry, you convey less meaning by the style. And I mean, it's fine when you're composing a poem, but a scripture of God, you're not supposed to, write it with your own hands, as to be said. The influence in retinue, so the family, like in verse 37. The uncertainty of this life, 43 and 44. A judgment scene comes after that, 45 to 51. Persistent unbelief in its result, probably later. The thunderbolt strikes, and the book is the book of people's deeds, probably. The reckoning from heaven, thunderbolt or tornado or something, right? Oh, wait, no, 48, there's an interjection here. The 48 and 49 is about idolatry as the same thing as worshiping Iblis. A Meccan passage, 1551. And the false gods, they're going to react. on the day of judgment, right? But there's a place of destruction. Where's the talk about the place of destruction? Oh, the Gulf. Okay. Kind of like the thing of Moses. The tide comes out, and then there's that rift in it, right? The story of Moses and Kidder about the same time as 9 through 11. Of course, we know the chapter was all the same time, right? So 59 to 81. Moses recognizes that the water in which the fish came to life was the spring in which he was in search. While often people to preserve the fish would keep it alive in the bucket, or if there was salt water, like in some of the narrations, again, they were preserving it. But there are fish that, seem to, you'd think they were dead, but, they flop back when they fall in some water or something. Al-Qidr, the green one, sort of, has by some been referred to Elias, but that doesn't seem to be the appropriate designation, or Elias. But the story of Kurash, Cyrus the Great, is actually pretty well fitting the story of 82 to 97, rather than Alexander the Great. It's not Alexander the Great, that's clear. In the Islam, there's no authentic teaching of the Prophet that would lead you to say Alexander the Great. But Juj Majuj, the Sakis people, the people from, the Russians, Turks, Tibetans, Chinese, that group of the people, the steppes of Asia, the Hyperboreans, yeah, that's something that's talked about. The part of the judgment scene connected with 45 and 47, 99 to 101, worship of angels, verse 102. Continuing to verse 48a. But it's not just anything that's a servant of God. Everything that's supposed to be a servant of God, whether it is or not. Because we're talking about, well, they serve God in some way, whether they're willing or unwilling. And then there's a reply to the taunt of the futility, Medina 103 to 106. And then the record of the righteous, like unto 102. Because, see, the Quran has this interweaving of connectedness. It doesn't mean that, it's not Genesis to Exodus, people. The Quran's not one of those books. Copiousness of revelation, early Medinan, 109. The prophet, human but inspired, Medinan, verse 110. Now, if you understand the Arabic, there's not the confusion in the passage. That all the applications or whatnot, maybe you don't have that, or maybe, what was going on during Muhammad's time that relates to this, maybe you don't have that. But the Quran stands on its own. I comment so much on the translations because it just makes me think of stuff, things that I've encountered to explain it, and other meaning, or perhaps there's indications that I don't think are supported there, and I'm following along with that. So Surah 19, the first part of this surah is devoted to stories of biblical personages. Fairly full accounts are given to Zechariah, of the Virgin Mary, and the birth of Jesus, and of Abraham, but the other stories are little more than notes, perhaps intended for future expansion. It is evident the first two stories at least came from Christian sources. For that of Zechariah, we hardly need to go beyond the first chapter of Luke's Gospel, though, of course, there is no need to assume that Muhammad had direct access to that. The story of the birth of Jesus shows the influence of apocryphal Gospels, notably the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi, the Gospel of James, initial letters, and the references to the book at the beginning of each story argue that it's in its present form. This part of the surah is Medinan, while the separated letters and being Medinan that's not it, sorry. And there are indications from the same date, but it seems probable from a variation of rhyme between an and yan that an earlier version underlay the present form. The passage in verse 59 to 64, which follows upon these stories, superficially appears to refer to them, but the end of verse 59 is not very appropriate as referring to the prophets of former times. It looks rather as if a passage from some other connection which had somehow come to stand at the end of the stories had been adapted by the addition of a phrase or two to refer to them. The rest of the surah from verse 69 onwards has no apparent connection with the stories at the beginning and seems to be connected in time rather with the original form of 59 to 64 than with them. If that be so, it must date from a time when the attitude to previous monotheists was still friendly, but we find the same variation of rhyme in this part of the surah, and there are other indications that it contains earlier and later elements. Now, so the one place where it switches the rhyme at the end, but it continues a rhyme, and then it's, you know, sort of the thing we find in instrument music having that effect in the Qur'an, but it's not just, you know, it's in with the subject and some neat stuff, right? Surah Maryam, the chapter of Mary, Zechariah and John the Baptist, probably Medinan. So the first 15 verses, Mary and Jesus, 16 to 37. And that's supposed to be Medinan. Okay. So the curtain reference, Proto-Evangelion, Jacob, chapter 10. The Zakat, well, the Quran doesn't say it was the first time these things were mentioned, right? The Zakat, so the obliged charity, but not in the technical sense. So the rule was different. Maybe there was a tithing back in the day. Who knows? It could have been a full tenth of your income, you know, because they didn't have, they weren't supposed to have regular taxes for the people. So, you know, that took care of the places of worship, the function of the government, et cetera, and the king wasn't supposed to get rich off it, but, you know, stuff happens. Yahya, that name relates to Surah 3, ayat 34. Luke 1, verse 61 will confirm the talk about never having the namesake. And then there'll be knights. Suggested. Signed to them. So it's wait, it's suggested. Where's note 3? Oh, 3 days. Okay. 3 nights is what it says. So perhaps he's just not allowed to talk after business hours. It's not so bad, right? Pseudo Matthew, probably more historical than the other Matthew, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aren't the ones who knew Jesus. That's clear. People just assume that they were written, you know, 60 years or 100 years or whatever the case in the individual thing is from when it was written, rather than 90 for John and then Luke, Matthew, Mark, 120, 130s, 150s. Was it Mark 150? It was something that the first manuscripts of those texts, about 150, one of them was. The birth pangs of the trunk of the tree. Okay, we talked about that. This Matthew. She's referring to Jesus as the child. Probably the reference to Jesus encouraging the Zakat is in reference to the obligatory alms for people of religion. You know, the alms giving and all that stuff. And Miriam, the sister of Moses. No, a lot of people had, that was actually some variation of Mary was one of the most common names at the time. Like that one program that they found a tomb, and it's like, well, if you took all the other information, what we know, it's probably half and half. It could be, you know, but if there were 4 historical Jesuses, that I'm thinking it was one of the historical Jesuses, but maybe it wasn't the Messiah part of Jesus, right? Oh, it's difficult when you refer to Jesus and he's not, but the Quran doesn't refer to the doesn't refer to Barabbas, doesn't refer to Barnabas, doesn't refer to any of those that may or may not in some version or other be included in the Jesus story. Apollonius, nope. Barabbas, nope. Barnabas, nope. But anyways, the statement of truth from Jesus. You know, the word of truth, as in referring to Jesus. Well, the exemplar prophets are the word, they're the living word, right? They're not just the book and stone, they're the living word. Now there's the book and stone, some prophets just pass on a message, they don't have inspired teachings with it. Warning to dissonance, 35 to 37, likely detached. Abraham Dinan may contain earlier elements, 42 to 51. Moses, Ishmael, Idris, Medinan, 52 to 58. Allah's special people, perhaps after 17106a. So 59 to 64. So there's the change appointing and purifying the religion. So the single-heartedness, the single focused attention is how they typically phrase it in the East, or something that translates to something like that. The blessed mount, you know, sacred landscape is important, but God decides sacred landscape, not us humans going around saying, like Vrindavan, where the guy that they call Chaitanya, his full name would be a better thing because Chaitanya has indications. I don't like to, he's called Chaitanya anyways, but the 24 places where the guy took a bath, maybe that's historical. He historically took baths in those 24 places, but pilgrimage to the guy's bathhouses? I mean, okay, that's kind of weird, dude. As suggested by Tori, Esdras or Ezra is referred to. You know, the book of Idris, but Idris is probably closer to Enoch, and they have similar meanings and stuff like that. But anyways, and the Ark of Noah carried, you know, more like a barge. We had the function of the angels, 65 and 66. Late Meccan, early Medinan. Objection to the resurrection, Meccan with early additions, 67 to 73. Muhammad's followers, not regarded significantly, 74 to 79. They delight, you know, the garden of delight, right? Oh, no, is that it? Yeah, no, it's the garden of Eden thing again. The command of, you know, the affair of God, the command of God. Not what people mean when they say they had an affair or something. That, you know, again, translation forms issues, and that's the number one reason why I throw comments in, is because I want some clarity about what the thing actually says, and to work through it myself. That's what I'm doing in my comments. I'm working out my thought on these things, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point. I want to be right. I don't want to be deemed right so much, you know, by the people who watch, as much as to be right. So don't leave me in my error. Now, if you differ in opinion, fine, share that too. Pride in Wealth and Family, late Meccan, verse 80 to 83. Polytheism, late Meccan, verse 84 to 87. No intercession except by God's permission, 88 to 90. God has no offspring, late Meccan, verse 93, 95. But we're starting verse 91, 92, and verse 96 is part of that too. Purpose of the revelation, 97 and 98. And the Quran's communicated to the prophet in his own language. Now, some of us experience mystical languages and stuff, but yeah, it's you know. And so at death, you leave your wealth and your children and your wives and all that behind, and just be ready for it. Surah 20, the surah makes no mention of the book, nor is there anything in it which necessarily carries us far in the Medinan period. It was probably designed as a chapter of the Qur'an in the narrower sense. It has not, however, been composed as a unity. The phrase at the end of verse 1, that thou mayest be miserable, breaks the connection with verse 2, but it's impossible to say with certainty whether this is a latter insertion or the original ending with which was omitted when verses 2 to 9 were added. The bulk of the surah consists of the story of Moses in its present form. This version of the story is almost certainly Medinan, but it bears evidence of having been built up at various times. The beginning of 8 through 12 is similar to the beginning of the story in 27 and to verse 29 of 28, and it's probably earlier than these passages. The name of the holy wadi occurs only here and in 79:16, and this is not part of the latter forms of the story. The doctrinal, verse 13 through 17, interrupt the story and must have been introduced when the eminence of the hour was in the forefront of Muhammad's teaching. The original story resumes at verse 18 and continues to verse 25. Well, just like 256 and some other passages of Surah 2 and some other passages of religious tolerance came at all periods. It wasn't just when Muhammad couldn't, and then Muhammad became complete control, and now he didn't. No. So a lot of these guesses, well, this was talked about more in this period, doesn't mean it wasn't talked about in other periods. The Quran's not a book where you can skip important things by just flipping around. And, oh, no, I don't like the first chapter, the last chapter, no, Genesis and Revelations, let's do something else. Or no, I don't like Daniel, or I do like Daniel, or I'm going to focus on those books. You know some of the games that people play. They've never read the whole Bible, and the Quran kind of urges you to read the whole thing. The original story resumes at 8. Well, the story resumes at verse 18 and continues to 25. To this story, Aaron did not belong, so that verses 26 to 36 are in addition to it. No, it's just, okay, and then there's another part to it. And verse 34, 35, which show a slightly different rhyme, are probably an even later insertion. The account of Moses' early life, verse 37 to 43, has evidently been introduced as an afterthought, whether at the same time as the Aaron episode or that of 34, 35 is uncertain. The story is resumed at verse 45, which practically repeats verse 25, but has been revised to include Aaron as well as Moses. Verses 55 and 57 are an early sign passage which has been adapted for use here. Verse 58 being a comment on it. From verse 59 to 72, Aaron plays no part in the story, so these verses are probably based on the original version, but they contain early Medinan phrases such as invent, not against a law of falsehood, but for a cursory mention of Aaron in verse 73. The passage 73 to 78 still speaks of Moses alone. It is, however, early in Medinan, as is shown by the phraseology of 75 and 77, especially. You can't entirely say that part, and there's plenty of historical evidence that you can't just, well, the phraseology here and there kind of, Verses 79 to 81 return to the early strand of the story, and 81 gives the climax of it as a story of punishment for unbelief. Though possibly this passage also has been freely composed, verse 82 to 84 are early Medinan, as is shown by the side glance at the controversy about the food restrictions, one of the earliest points of difference with the Jews in Medina. Verse 85 to 98 shows peculiarities which seem to indicate a revision. The first form seems to have consisted of verses 85 to 90a, 94 to 95. The fault of the people here is that they do not follow Moses and fail to keep up the appointment. The end of 87 has probably been modified to introduce the reference to a summary. It relates to ancient Egyptian term for a caravan leader. The original ending may have been Phanesia, which now it stands not quite appropriately. At the end of 90, the episode of the golden calf has been superimposed upon this, and the blame of it is laid upon a summary. The mysterious personage who is only mentioned here is probably the supposed founder of the Samaritan community. Nope, that's not what they're saying. Muhammad, having confused the episode of the golden calf with the setting up of the calf worship in Samaria by Jeroboam. Okay, see, referring to the Sumerians, right? Horowitz, KU, page 114, F, E, I, Art, Sa, Marie. The revision, well, that which is introduced in the passage at the end of 87, verses 90b, 91, 92, 93, on the back of 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, unless perhaps 91, 92, 93, 98 were slightly later afterthoughts. Verse 99 to 101 from the epilogue to the story, but another is found at 112. The latter is probably the earlier. The intervening eschatological matter can hardly be a unity. In fact, the reference to questions being asked, which reminds one of early Medinan passages, intimates a new beginning at verse 105, while the position with regard to intercession is stated in 108, is almost fairly certainly later than verse 102 to 104, which strike one as fairly early and belong to the period when the length of time between death and the resurrection was one of the arguments Muhammad had to meet. Possibly, though not certainly, verse 108 to 111 are the continuation of verse 99 to 100, while 102 to 104, 105 to 107 were separate pieces on the backs of which the two passages were written. The passage dealing with the covenant with Adam, verse 114 to 126, probably belonged at the same time as the later epilogue to this Moses' story, although verse 115 looks at it as if it had been patched in. And so much must have displayed some description of the garden. A series of rather loosely connected passages, mainly in the form of exhortations to the prophet, show signs of here and there, bring the surah to a close. They seem on the whole to be earlier than the Adam section which precedes. Possibly it was written on the back of them. Surah Taha, the chapter TH. In the name of Allah, the merciful, the compassionate. Okay, the purpose of revelation in the Qur'an, late Meccan, early Medinan, for the first 7 verses. Then we have the story of Moses, verse 8 to where's is it the whole chapter? No, I guess verse 98. And Medinan, but thought to be of different times. Tua, Taweh, from the ancient Egyptian, 2 lands. What does his comment say? Perhaps a misreading of Tura, Mount, from Syriac? No, nothing here's a misreading, but, and where did he go? So the prayer for the remembrance, some read the dhikra instead of dhikri. Okay. And then we have literal mention of the wing. What is the wing? Oh, the thing into the sea, cast him into the sea. So the mother casting the child in a vessel into the sea, into the river, and someone will pick it up as it floats down the river. That's quite some trust, because it's so easy for things to turn over or whatever, or just be stuck out there and the baby died, right? You press your hand to the side, to your wing, and it comes forth white. So maybe was a light being with its wing that made his hand white, is what that passage is literally saying. The motive for the motive for the idea that Moses is going to bring them out of their land and conquer. Well, if it relates to verse 57, or if it relates to the fact that people did try to conquer Egypt. The Hyksos people definitely tried to conquer Egypt. And if Moses, especially if he knew that Moses was, oh, you're one of those people from the north, we know it, but we raised you as one of our own, but you probably figured it out, and now you want to conquer for your people, right? Is that what you're doing here? That explains the whole thing. It's again not difficult. And how can someone who's read the Bible not understand that this is probably what the Quran's saying too? The point is the Gala Day, the day of adornment. I say it's either Nakandajus or Rakunwar, so the little heat in July or the Great Heat Festival in August. That's my guess of when the festival that you meet in the morning is, especially when you're considering the later signs to happen here. Could be Mahwast, the summer solstice, but so the Pharaoh, they took Pharaoh as their, not just their ruler, but a chief in other ways, the magicians. But these magicians decided, hey, decide what you want. We've decided to take Moses' side, at least theologically here. So a lot of people with their idolatry and all that sort of stuff will say, hey, you've just forgotten how it is, right? So he said, so Samari said, but perhaps they said too. It's like, well, we were in Egypt and there was a cow goddess, and we just don't really remember what the thing is. It wasn't really our custom, but it was, verse 94 has a note here that connects you to Moses, the brother of Moses, the son of a mother. It kind of sounds like you're swearing, son of a mother. But if you're using something dirty or sexual or perhaps disagreeable or something as a non-literal explicit, that's what swearing is. So he literally meant the son of his mother. And there's unclear response. Okay, well, how can I say this? Deluded himself. Yeah, the Samari got these ideas of sihr and idolatry and stuff like this. Yeah, you delude yourself, whether or not other people have done it too. So then you have an epilogue, 99 to 101, perhaps towards the final time of the verses here. There's a reply to the objection length from 102 to 104. So there's the color of the eyes that can, the blued eyes. There's eyes condition. It's not talking about your typical people with blue eyes or hazel or whatever color of, or brown or whatever color of eyes they have. It's talking about the blue, the blurred bluiness of sickness. And it probably happens less in humans because we can see some of the signs coming. And people are like, well, you've only remained 10 days or that sort of thing. I was raised in a church that said, well, if we are going to be punished, we're only going to be like there a week or whatever. Really, you're going to be in fire worse than anything that lava provides, like a nuclear blast or something, that you survive every moment and you replenish yourself or whatever. You have to be in that for a week or just a few lashes down there. And then you get even a few lashes. It's like, it can wipe out the pleasure of this earth, really. If that's literally true and what's going to happen. So, you got to be very careful with your language there, right? The mountains at the last day, early Medinan, 105 to 107. Intercession only by Allah's permission, continuation of 99 to 101. This is 108 to 111. The epilogue to the story of Moses. Well, you can go back and forth and address in different ways. 112 to 126. Oh, this chapter has more verses than I remember, but don't hasten the Quran. The Quran's, whether it's learning, whatever, it's some people learned a tenth, spent years learning a tenth when they perhaps could have learned more, but they were trying to apply it, right? So God, the true king, the true and final determiner, and the grave will seem like, even if it's thousands of years, it's not going to seem like that much, right? And 127 is a type of ending to the story of Moses after 82. And the connection of 128 to 132 is kind of not understood, but Meccan. And we have the remembrance of God. What is the remembrance of God tied to? What verse here? Okay. My reminder. Yeah, life gets narrower and more difficult and stuff if you discard from the, that sort of thing of God. Endure and practice piety, Meccan, 130 to 132. Demand for a sign, 133 to 135. That's Meccan. And page 247, we talk about the no provision. So the prophets aren't paid for their role in religion. That's just not part of it. And same thing with us who lead a prayer, or we need to drop off this ritual for hire stuff. So there's a punishment before, interpreted as meaning God does not require Muhammad to, well, there's the last day in the punishment. God does not require Muhammad to provide for himself and his household, but probably means that God does not demand offerings like as the false gods did. But no, it's actually refers to both. God doesn't have his needs provided for by any of this stuff going on, and it's Muhammad's not getting paid for his religious thing, because we do definitely find this complete removal of the idea that Muhammad got paid as a prophet. He was a farmer, he was a trader, he was a general. He kept, he kept away from himself as much of the wealth that came in as a general and head of state as possible. And he provided for his family. That's about it. And people were concerned about how little he kept of what he could have. But the idea for generations actually was the first for 4 generations, the general idea was it was abhorrent to be paid for leading religious services. For even the Caliph was supposed to take a minimum salary. The head of state was to be a person that the people would generally protect regardless. It wasn't, they go around all dainty and all this other stuff like you hear of